The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, pale yellow like old parchment, with his name written in handwriting he didn't recognize. Michael Chen stood in the narrow hallway of his rented apartment, still wearing his security guard uniform from the night shift, holding this strange piece of mail that felt heavier than it should. The return address meant nothing to him. Inside was a check for $17,000 and a single sentence typed on plain paper, for the son who believed when no one else did. His father had been dead for 3 weeks. The funeral was small, poorly attended, held in a chapel that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and artificial flowers. Michael's older brother hadn't even bothered to show up, claimed he had a work conference in Dallas that couldn't be rescheduled. Their father died the way he'd lived the last decade of his life, quietly, without making demands, in a studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens were the only reliable soundtrack. The check in Michael's hands now represented everything the old man had left behind, minus burial costs and outstanding debts. $17,000. Not enough to retire on, not enough to impress anyone. But enough, Michael thought as he sat down heavily on his second-hand couch, to do something his father never got the chance to do. The decision formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on a window pane. By evening, it had hardened into certainty. By midnight, Michael had drafted the resignation letter to the security company where he'd worked for 6 years, guarding empty office buildings while other people built lives he could only imagine. By dawn, he'd cancelled his lease, sold his car to a neighbor for cash, and purchased a one-way bus ticket to a place he'd never been, based entirely on something his father had said once, years ago, in a conversation Michael had almost forgotten. Everyone thought he was crazy for doing it. "You're throwing your life away," his brother said over the phone, voice sharp with the kind of certainty that comes from never having questioned anything. "Dad left you money to get ahead, not to chase some fantasy. You have a stable job, benefits, a retirement plan." Michael listened to the hum of traffic outside his window, watched a plastic bag tumble across the parking lot in the evening wind. "Dad had a stable job too," he said quietly. "For 37 years. He died with $17,000 to his name." The silence on the other end felt judgmental, heavy with things unsaid. His co-workers were no kinder when he turned in his resignation. "You're making a mistake," his supervisor said, a man with 15 years at the company and a face that wore exhaustion like a permanent mask. "Jobs like this don't grow on trees. You walk away now, there's no coming back." Michael handed over his uniform, his badge, his keys to the building he'd spent 6 years protecting from threats that never materialized. "I know," he said. What he didn't say, what he couldn't explain to people who measured success in steady paychecks and predictable tomorrows, was what his father had told him during one of their last real conversations, back when the old man could still walk without assistance. Before the cancer made everything smaller and quieter, they'd been sitting in a diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booze and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. Michael had just complained about his job, the monotony, the feeling of time slipping past, while he stood guard over empty hallways. His father had looked at him with eyes that carried decades of quiet regret and said, "I spent my whole life being practical. You know what practical got me? A lot of years I can't get back." Before we go further into Michael's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where these stories travel, how far they reach. And if you're finding something in Michael's decision that resonates, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this need witnesses. The bus to Montana took 43 hours. Rolling through landscapes that shifted from urban sprawl to endless plains to mountains that looked like they'd been carved by something ancient and unforgiving. Michael sat by a window that wouldn't quite close all the way, letting in thin streams of cold air that smelled like diesel and distance. He carried everything he owned in 2 duffel bags at his feet: clothes, books, his father's watch, and a manila folder containing printouts of property listings in a town called Redemption, population 800 and declining. The town his father had mentioned once, almost casually, as a place he'd visited in his 20s, before responsibilities calcified around him like concrete. "Most beautiful place I ever saw," the old man had said, staring at nothing in particular. "If I could do it over, I'd have bought land there when it was cheap, built something with my hands, lived somewhere the air didn't taste like exhaust." Michael had searched for Redemption online during his night shifts, during those long hours between midnight and dawn when the security monitors showed nothing but empty rooms and flickering hallway lights. What he found was a dying mining town, population hemorrhaging year by year, properties selling for prices that seemed almost fictional compared to the cramped city apartments he could barely afford, houses with land, actual land, acres of it, for less than a used car would cost. The folder in his bag contained listings for 5 properties, all foreclosures or estate sales, all priced under $15,000. His plan, such as it was, involved buying one of these places, learning everything he could about sustainable living, and building a life his father had dreamed about but never dared to pursue. When he told people this, when he tried to explain it to his brother, to former friends who'd slowly drifted away over the years, they looked at him like he'd announced plans to join a cult or renounce modern civilization entirely. "You don't know anything about living off the grid," his brother had said. "You've never even changed your own oil." This was true. It was also, Michael thought, as the bus climbed into mountain passes, where the air grew thin and clean, entirely beside the point. The first person he met in Redemption was a woman named Sarah Whitmore, owner of the only real estate office still operating in town, which she ran out of what used to be a hardware store. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that looked like they'd done more than shuffle paperwork in their time. When Michael walked in with his duffel bags and his folder of printouts, she studied him with the kind of assessment that strips away pretense. "You're the one who called about the Hendricks property," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "You know it hasn't had running water in 4 years. Roof's got holes. Foundation's questionable. Previous owner died in there and wasn't found for 2 weeks. Michael set his bags down. "How much?" "12,000 cash." "As is." "I'll take it." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition of something she'd seen before in people who showed up here running from one life towards something they couldn't quite name. "You want to see it first?" "Already saw the pictures online." "Those pictures are generous." "I'm sure they are." She pulled out paperwork that looked like it had been photocopied from originals that predated personal computers. "Mind if I ask what you're running from?" Michael thought about his answer while she laid forms across the desk. "Not running from anything. Running towards something, maybe." "And what would that be?" "I don't know yet." Sarah made a sound that might have been approval. "That's honest, at least. Most people who show up here claim they've got it all figured out. They're usually gone within 6 months. If you're still watching, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And leave a comment about whether you've ever made a decision everyone else thought was crazy. I read every single one. The Hendricks property sat 3 miles outside of town, accessible by a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and became nearly impassable when it snowed. The house itself looked like it was in active negotiations with gravity, a small structure that might once have been painted white but had faded to the color of old bones. The windows that weren't broken were covered in years of dust and bird droppings. The yard, if it could be called that, was an overgrown tangle of wild grass and what Sarah identified as mostly thistle and regret. Michael stood looking at it in the fading afternoon light, his entire inheritance reduced to this: a collapsing house on 7 acres of land that nobody else wanted, in a town that people were actively abandoning. Behind him, Sarah's truck idled, waiting to see if he'd change his mind. "Still want it?" she called out. "Yes, Mum. You're either brave or stupid. Haven't decided which. Probably some of both." The transaction took less than an hour. Sarah had clearly done this before, knew how to move property in a town where buyers were rare and sellers were often desperate. By sunset, Michael owned the Hendricks place, had the title in hand, and found himself standing alone in what used to be a living room, watching light filter through holes in the roof, trying to figure out what exactly he'd just done. The first night, he slept on the floor in a sleeping bag he'd bought at a gas station, listening to sounds he'd never heard before: wind moving through empty spaces, animals he couldn't identify calling to each other in the darkness, the settling of old wood and older dreams. It was May, but at this elevation the temperature dropped hard after dark, and he woke several times shivering, questioning everything. By morning, doubt had crystallized into a kind of determined clarity. He walked the property in the early light, cataloguing what needed to be done. The list was long. The list was probably impossible. But it was his list now, his impossible project. His father's unlived dream becoming his actual life. The hardware store in town, the same building where Sarah ran her real estate office, became his classroom. The owner, a man named Jack Patterson, who'd lived in Redemption his entire 72 years, took one look at Michael's purchase and laughed, not unkindly. "You bought the Hendricks place? Christ, son, you planning to burn it down for the insurance? Planning to fix it up?" Jack's laughter faded into something like respect. "Well, that's ambitious. You know anything about construction? Plumbing? Electrical?" "No, sir." "You know anything about anything?" "I know how to learn." This answer seemed to satisfy something in Jack. He started pulling items off shelves, basic tools, supplies, a notebook where he sketched out rough plans for addressing the most critical problems first. "Roof before winter," he said. "That's non-negotiable. Foundation next. Everything else can wait." "You got money for materials?" Michael calculated quickly. After the purchase, he had maybe $4,000 left. "Some. It'll have to be enough. I'll give you a discount. Not out of charity. I just don't want to watch another property fall into the ground out there. Bad for the whole town's spirit." For the next 6 months, Michael lived in what amounted to a construction zone, learning skills he'd never imagined needing. He watched YouTube videos on his phone until the battery died, then watched them again the next day. He made mistakes that cost him time and money. He fell through part of the roof he was trying to repair and had to drive himself to the emergency clinic 2 towns over for stitches. He learned about snow loads and thermal bridges, and why you can't just patch drywall over water damage without addressing the source. People in town watched with a mix of amusement and pity. At the diner where he ate breakfast most mornings, the only meal he allowed himself out, everything else cooked on a camping stove, conversations would pause when he walked in, then resume in lower tones. He heard fragments. "City boy playing homesteader. Won't last through winter. Shame to waste money like that. Are you still with me? If this story is hitting something real for you, leave a comment. Tell me about a time you had to block out other people's voices to hear your own. And subscribe if you haven't already. There's more to Michael's story than anyone expected. His brother called once in July, voice tight with what might have been concern or might have been vindication. "How's your project going?" Michael was sitting on what was slowly becoming a repaired porch, watching the sun set over mountains that still took his breath away every single evening. His hands were covered in cuts and calluses. His bank account was approaching zero. His body hurt in places he didn't know could hurt. It's going. You ready to admit this was a mistake? Not yet. You're running out of money. I know. You're going to fail, Michael. You're going to end up broke and homeless, and you'll have wasted everything Dad left you. Michael looked at the house behind him. The roof no longer leaked. The foundation was stabilized. Windows had been replaced. It still looked rough, still needed months or maybe years of work, but it wasn't collapsing anymore. It was becoming something. Maybe, he said, but at least I'll have tried. His brother hung up without saying goodbye. By September, Michael's money was gone. The house was livable in a technical sense. It had a roof that didn't leak, walls that mostly held heat, a wood stove he'd installed himself after watching 17 different instructional videos and consulting with Jack at the hardware store. But livable wasn't the same as comfortable, and livable definitely wasn't the same as profitable. This was the problem he hadn't fully considered, the question that now demanded answers. How do you make money in a dying town where jobs don't exist and opportunities are as scarce as water in a desert? He found work where he could. Sarah hired him to help clear out foreclosed properties, grim work that involved hauling decades of accumulated belongings to the dump while trying not to think too hard about the lives that had been lived and abandoned in these spaces. Jack occasionally needed help at the hardware store, moving stock and making deliveries to the few remaining ranchers in the area. A local woman named Margaret Chen, who ran a small organic farm with her wife, paid him to help with harvest. None of it added up to enough. By October, Michael was behind on the property taxes he hadn't budgeted for, eating one meal a day and seriously considering whether his brother had been right all along. That's when he discovered what would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. The Hendricks property included 7 acres, most of it wild land he hadn't bothered exploring yet, focused as he'd been on making the house habitable. One afternoon in late October, walking the property line to clear his head and figure out what to do next, he found the old greenhouse. It was hidden behind a stand of overgrown pine trees, maybe 200 feet from the house, a structure he'd somehow missed in all his previous surveys of the land. The glass was mostly intact, though decades of neglect had turned it opaque with dirt and algae. The frame was metal, rusted but structurally sound. Inside, the remains of what had once been growing beds lined both walls, soil gone hard as concrete, but the bones of something purposeful still visible. Michael stood in the doorway of this forgotten structure, watching afternoon light filter through dirty glass, and felt something click into place. Not an answer exactly, but the beginning of one. He spent the next week researching instead of job hunting, burning through data on his phone, taking notes in a composition book he'd bought for 50 cents at the hardware store. What he learned was this: redemption sat at an altitude and climate that made conventional farming difficult, but created perfect conditions for something else entirely. Something that was becoming increasingly valuable in markets hundreds of miles away. Something that required minimal startup capital if you knew what you were doing and were willing to learn fast. Medicinal herbs and specialty microgreens for high-end restaurants. The market was there. The demand was there. What had been a hippie niche 20 years ago had become a legitimate industry, with restaurants in cities paying premium prices for fresh, locally grown organic specialty produce they couldn't source elsewhere. And the greenhouse, once cleaned and repaired, offered something most competitors didn't have: the ability to grow year-round, even through Montana winters. Jack listened to Michael's plan while restocking shelves, his expression carefully neutral. "You know anything about growing things?" "No, sir, but I didn't know anything about fixing roofs either." "That's true. You also damn near killed yourself learning." "But I learned." Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying Michael in a way that felt like assessment. Finally he nodded. "My wife used to grow herbs, sold them at farmers' markets before her arthritis got bad. I've got all her supplies in the basement: seeds, soil amendments, growing guides. Been meaning to throw them out for years, but never got around to it. You want them, they're yours." This kind of thing kept happening. Sarah donated old growing tables her mother had used. Margaret showed him how to test and amend soil, shared seedlings from her own stock. A retired couple who'd heard about his project showed up with 2 truckloads of composted manure and refused payment. The town that had watched him with skeptical amusement was quietly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to invest in his success. Still, investment from neighbors didn't pay bills. By November, Michael was down to his last $100. The greenhouse was only partially functional, and winter was arriving early with storms that reminded him exactly how isolated and vulnerable his position really was. If you've made it this far in the story, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment telling me you're still here. Say anything, your city, your own story, why this matters to you. These comments feed the algorithm, yes, but more than that, they remind me why I'm telling these stories. And please hit subscribe. Michael's journey is about to take a turn nobody saw coming. The first real snow hit in mid-November. 3 feet in 36 hours, temperatures dropping to numbers Michael had only seen on weather reports from places he'd had no intention of visiting. His wood stove, which had seemed adequate during autumn, revealed itself as barely sufficient. He burned through his wood supply faster than anticipated, spent 2 days cutting and splitting more in weather that made every movement hurt, came inside each night so cold he couldn't feel his fingers for an hour. His brother called during the worst of it, as if sensing weakness. "Ready to come home yet?" Michael was wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned, watching his breath form clouds in what passed for his living room. "This is home." "That's not home. That's a disaster you're too stubborn to walk away from." "Maybe. You're going to freeze to death out there for what? Some fantasy about living off the land? Dad's romantic bullshit about a place he visited once 40 years ago?" Something in Michael's chest went very cold, colder than the air around him. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't tell you the truth. Someone needs to. You've thrown away a real life for this. A stable job. A future. You took Dad's money, the only thing he managed to leave behind after wasting his entire life being too scared to take chances, and you blew it on a condemned house in the middle of nowhere. You're failing. You're failing exactly like he did, just in a different way." Michael ended the call, sat in the cold silence, thought about his father, about all those years working jobs that ground him down into something small and tired, about the man who died with $17,000 and a lifetime of unlived dreams. Thought about the difference between failing while trying and succeeding at never trying at all. He spent the next morning working in the greenhouse, despite the cold, despite the rational voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his brother, listing all the ways this was pointless. He'd managed to get the heating system partially functional, a jury-rigged combination of thermal mass, insulation, and a small propane heater he could barely afford to run. His first crop of microgreens was actually growing, tiny shoots of life pushing up through soil that had been dead and forgotten for years. They were beautiful in a way he hadn't expected, fragile, determined, improbable. That afternoon, he drove 2 hours to a restaurant in a larger town, bringing samples of what he'd managed to grow. Micro-arugula, purple radish sprouts, specialty lettuce varieties. The chef was a woman named Diane Zhang, maybe 45, with the kind of intensity that suggested she didn't suffer fools. She looked at Michael's samples with professional skepticism. "Where are you growing these?" "Redemption. I've got a greenhouse on 7 acres. "Redemption." She looked up. "That ghost town, what are you doing out there?" "Trying to build something." She tasted his arugula. Her expression didn't change. She tasted the radish sprouts, the lettuce, set down her fork. "These are good, really good. The arugula especially. There's a pepperiness you don't usually get with microgreens. You using anything special in your soil? Just compost and some amendments a local farmer recommended. I'll take whatever you can provide. How much can you grow? This was the question he hadn't wanted to answer honestly. Right now, maybe 10 pounds a week, but I'm expanding. By spring, I should be able to do 50 pounds weekly, maybe more. Diane calculated something in her head. I'll start with 10 pounds weekly, $75 per pound, delivered fresh every Monday morning. You miss a delivery, we're done. You deliver anything that's not this quality, we're done. Understood. $75 per pound. 10 pounds a week. Michael did the math quickly. $750 weekly, $3,000 a month. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't security. But it was enough. Enough to pay taxes, buy supplies, keep the heat on, keep growing. Understood, he said. Good. I'll need your licensing and certification information. Michael, who had been feeling something dangerously close to hope, felt it drain away. My what? You need to be certified for commercial food production, licensed, inspected. You don't have that. Diane's expression shifted from interested to dismissive in a heartbeat. Come back when you do. The drive home took 3 hours in snow that had started falling again, roads that became increasingly treacherous, and a silence inside the truck that felt like failure settling in. Getting certified required money he didn't have, time he couldn't afford, inspections that would likely reveal dozens of problems with his makeshift operation. He was watching the opportunity slip away before it had even fully materialized. Are you still watching? If you are, leave a comment. Tell me about a time you were this close to something you needed, and it started falling apart. And subscribe if this story is making you feel something real. Jack was closing the hardware store when Michael pulled up. The old man took one look at his face and sighed. Come on in. Coffee's still hot. They sat in the office in the back, surrounded by decades of inventory records and dust. Michael explained about the restaurant, the order, the certification problem. Jack listened without interrupting, hands wrapped around a chipped mug that said, World's okayest dad. How much does certification cost? Jack asked finally. Between fees, inspections, required equipment modifications, maybe $2,000, money I don't have. And if you had it, could you make this work? Michael thought about the greenhouse, about the crops already growing, about Diane Zhang's offer. Yes, I think so. But thinking so isn't the same as knowing. No, Jack agreed. It isn't. But sometimes thinking so is all you get to work with. He was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee like it might contain answers. I'm going to make you an offer. You can accept it or refuse it, but you need to understand what it means either way. Michael waited. I'll loan you $3,000, interest-free. You pay it back when you can, and if you can't, we'll work something out. But that's not the real offer. The real offer is this. I believe you can do this. I've lived in this town 72 years. I've watched it die slowly, watched people give up and leave, watched businesses close and houses fall apart. You're the first person in maybe 20 years who showed up here trying to build something instead of escape something. That matters. That means something. Jack, I'm not finished. The loan comes with conditions. You take this money, you're committing. No giving up when it gets hard. No running back to whatever city you came from when you get scared. You're all in, or you're out entirely. I won't enable another half-finished dream. We've got enough of those already. Michael felt something in his throat. Something that might have been gratitude or fear or recognition of what was being offered here. Not just money, but faith. Investment in a future that was far from guaranteed. Why? He asked. Why would you do this? Jack smiled, tired and real. Because your father never got the chance, and because watching you try is the most interesting thing that's happened in this town since they closed the mine. Also, Margaret's wife Amy is a food safety inspector. She'll get you certified for half the usual cost if I ask nicely, and promise to fix their barn door I've been putting off for 2 years. The certification process took 3 weeks and revealed exactly how much Michael still didn't know about commercial food production. Amy Chen went through his operation with thorough professionalism, documenting problems and explaining solutions with the kind of patience that suggested she'd seen worse. The list of required changes was long but manageable. Michael spent late November and early December implementing them, working by flashlight and determination, transforming his makeshift operation into something that could pass professional scrutiny. He made his first delivery to Diane Zhang's restaurant the first Monday in December. 10 pounds of mixed microgreens, packed carefully in containers he'd bought with borrowed money, driven 2 hours in pre-dawn darkness to arrive before the morning prep began. Diane inspected everything with the same professional skepticism she'd shown before, then nodded. "Next week, same time. Don't be late." Michael drove home with $750 in cash, more money than he'd held at once since buying the property. He paid Jack back $300, bought supplies with $200, and allowed himself one completely impractical luxury, a good winter coat from a thrift store 2 towns over, because his father's old jacket, which he'd been wearing all this time, was literally held together with duct tape and hope. The money was nice, the warm coat was nice, but what surprised him, what he hadn't expected, was the feeling of having done something, of having turned possibility into reality, of watching tiny seeds become actual income through nothing but work and learning, and stubborn refusal to accept other people's certainty about his failure. By January, he'd added 2 more restaurant clients. By February, a boutique grocery store in a wealthy ski resort town 3 hours away. By March, 1 year after that yellow envelope arrived with his father's final gift, Michael was producing 70 pounds of specialty produce weekly, grossing close to $5,500 a month, with a waiting list of potential clients he didn't yet have capacity to serve. The brother who'd called him crazy stopped calling entirely. Not out of spite, Michael suspected, but because there was nothing left to say. No warnings left to issue. No intervention that hadn't already been attempted and rejected. If you're still here, do me a favor, like this video. Comment about whether you've ever had to prove someone wrong by proving yourself right. And subscribe, because we're getting close to the moment when everything Michael built almost came crashing down. Spring brought new challenges. The greenhouse, which had been adequate for winter growing, became oppressively hot as temperatures rose. His water supply, which relied on a well of questionable reliability, started showing signs of strain. Equipment that had seemed sturdy enough revealed weaknesses under constant use, and the work itself, the daily relentless work of growing, harvesting, packing, delivering, began to show the difference between a sprint and a marathon. Michael was exhausted in ways he'd never experienced, even during those early months of renovation. This was different. This wasn't the exhaustion of building something, but of maintaining something, of meeting expectations every single day without fail, of knowing that missed deliveries meant lost clients and lost clients meant the entire fragile structure could collapse. He'd wake at 4 in the morning to harvest, pack by 6, drive 2 to 4 hours depending on delivery locations, return home to plant, water, maintain, fall into bed by 10, repeat. No days off, no vacations, no margin for error or illness or the kind of life that involved anything beyond work. Sarah stopped by one April morning, bringing coffee and a worried expression. "You look terrible." "Thanks." "I'm serious, Michael. When's the last time you took a day off?" He couldn't remember. "It's growing season. This is when I make enough to survive the winter." "You won't survive anything if you work yourself to death." She sat on his porch, now fully repaired, almost attractive even, and studied him like she had that first day in her office. You're doing something nobody thought possible. The whole town's watching, whether you know it or not. But success isn't just proving everyone wrong. It's building something sustainable, something that doesn't destroy you in the process. I don't know how to do that, he admitted. I don't know how to grow slower. If I cut back on deliveries, I lose clients. If I lose clients, I can't afford to keep the operation running. So you need to scale up, not back. Scale up requires capital I don't have. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching morning light touch the mountains. What if you did have it? What would scaling up look like? Michael had thought about this during those 4 a.m. drives, during the endless hours of repetitive work that gave his hands something to do, while his mind wandered through possibilities. Another greenhouse. Automated irrigation. Maybe a helper or two. That would let me triple production without tripling my workload. But we're talking $30,000, maybe $40,000 in investment. And you could pay that back? With increased production? Within 2 years, probably. But that's assuming nothing goes wrong, which is a dangerous assumption. Sarah stood, finished her coffee, turned to leave. At the truck, she paused. There's a community development grant. Federal program designed to help rural businesses. I've been serving on the local review board. Application deadline is next month. You should apply. I'm not a business. I'm just one person with a greenhouse. You're a commercial food producer with multiple wholesale clients and expansion potential that could create jobs in a dying town. That's exactly what they're looking for. I'll email you the information. The grant application was 47 pages of questions Michael had no idea how to answer. Business projections, financial forecasts, community impact assessments, market analysis. He spent 2 weeks struggling through it, feeling more inadequate with each section. Finally, Margaret stopped by to check on a compost order and found him sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers, looking defeated. "What's all this?" she asked. He explained. She read through what he'd written so far, her expression carefully neutral. Then she laughed, not mockingly but with recognition. "Michael, you're thinking about this all wrong. You're trying to sound like some MBA graduate. That's not who you are. That's not why this matters. Then what should I say? Tell them the truth. Tell them about your father, about buying a condemned house everyone said was worthless, about bringing life back to land people had given up on. Tell them about Jack's loan and Amy's inspection and Sarah's coffee visits. Tell them you're not trying to build a tech startup. You're trying to build something real in a place people have written off as dead. That's the story they need to hear." So that's what he wrote, stripped away the business jargon and the trying too hard professionalism, and wrote about why he was here, what he was building, and why it mattered beyond profit margins and growth projections. Sent it off with the kind of hope that feels dangerous because it's too easy to crush. The response came in June. A formal letter with a government seal that made Michael's hand shake as he opened it. He'd been accepted. $40,000 disbursed over 2 years, with accountability measures and quarterly reporting requirements. But his, real money, enough to build the second greenhouse, install professional irrigation systems, hire help, transform what had been a desperate hustle into something that might actually resemble a sustainable business. Jack drove out to celebrate, bringing steaks he insisted on grilling, despite Michael's protests about wasting money on food. They ate on the porch as the sun set, the view that had once been the only good thing about this property, now just one detail among many. "Proud of you," Jack said. Michael didn't know how to respond to that. His father had never said those words. His brother certainly hadn't. The phrase felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. "I just filled out an application. You're the one who made it possible." "No, I loaned you money. You did everything else. You took a condemned property and made it productive. You learned skills you didn't have. You built relationships with clients who trust you. You proved everyone wrong, including probably yourself." Jack paused. Including your brother. He still thinks I'm crazy. Maybe you are, but being crazy and being wrong aren't the same thing. Your brother played it safe his whole life, just like your father did. Safe has its place. Safe pays the bills and builds retirement accounts. But safe doesn't build anything new. Safe doesn't change anything. Safe is just trading time for money until you run out of time. Subscribe if you haven't already. Seriously, Michael's story is about to take another turn, and you won't want to miss what happens when his brother finally shows up in redemption. The second greenhouse went up in July, constructed by a crew Jack recommended, local guys who needed work and who showed up mostly on time and mostly sober, and who did the job for less than market rate because, as one of them explained, it's nice to build something instead of watching things fall apart. By August, Michael had hired 2 part-time helpers, a young woman named Emma who'd grown up on a farm 3 counties over and was trying to save money for college, and a retired aerospace engineer named Robert who'd moved to Redemption specifically because it was cheap and quiet and who turned out to have an unexpected passion for hydroponic systems. Production tripled, client list expanded. The operation that had been held together by determination and duct tape became something approaching professional. Michael was still working brutal hours, but they were distributed differently now, spent less on manual labor and more on management, on planning, on building relationships with new restaurants and stores that wanted what he was growing. His bank account, which had once been measured in double digits, now had 4 digits. Then 5. The property that he'd bought for $12,000 was now worth, according to Sarah's professional assessment, somewhere around $80,000, mostly due to the infrastructure he'd built and the demonstrated income stream. Numbers that still seemed abstract, almost fictional, but were becoming increasingly real. His brother called in September, 14 months since their last conversation. "I heard you got some kind of government grant." "News travels," Michael said. "I also heard you're employing people, making actual money." "Some." There was a long pause. "I'm coming out there. To visit, to see what you've built." Michael should have expected this, but somehow hadn't. The brother who'd called him crazy, who'd predicted failure with absolute certainty, was now requesting access to the success he'd claimed was impossible. "Why?" "Because I was wrong, and because I want to understand how you did it." The visit happened in October, almost exactly 2 years after Michael had found the greenhouse. His brother arrived in a rental car that looked absurdly out of place on the muddy access road, wearing clothes that screamed city consultant, carrying an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been something more complicated. Michael gave him the tour. The house, now properly insulated and winterized and actually comfortable, the original greenhouse running at full capacity with automated systems Robert had designed. The new greenhouse, larger and more sophisticated, the packing area, the walk-in cooler powered by solar panels, the composting operation, the 7 acres that had been worthless land now transformed into productive space worth more than either of them made in a year. His brother was quiet through most of it, asking occasional questions, taking it all in. Finally, standing in the new greenhouse surrounded by trays of microgreens that would be harvested tomorrow and delivered the day after, he said, "I told you this was crazy. You did. I was wrong." Michael had imagined this moment during those brutal early months, imagined the satisfaction of hearing this admission. But standing here now, watching his brother struggle with words, he felt something different. Not vindication, not triumph. Just a kind of sad recognition of everything his brother had sacrificed by never taking chances. "You weren't entirely wrong," Michael said. "It was crazy. It could have failed a dozen different ways. Sometimes I think it only worked because I didn't know enough to understand how impossible it was. But you tried anyway." "Yeah, I tried anyway. His brother walked between the growing beds, touching leaves with city hands that had never grown anything. I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, about what you said, that he died with $17,000 after 37 years of steady work. I used to think that was responsible, safe, the smart way to live. It was safe, Michael acknowledged. Was it? He died with money, but also with regrets, with dreams he never pursued, with a whole life he could have lived but didn't because he was too afraid of failing. His brother stopped, turned. I'm 42 years old. I make good money. I have a retirement plan. I haven't taken a risk since college, and I look at what you've built here, this crazy, improbable thing that everyone said would fail, and I realize I'm making the same choice Dad made, trading possibility for security, except now I'm old enough to understand what that trade actually costs. If you're still here, leave a comment. Tell me what you're trading for security, what dreams you're deferring, what your version of redemption might look like, and please subscribe. We're getting close to the moment that changed everything. They talked into the night, drinking the good whiskey his brother had brought as a peace offering, sitting on the porch while temperatures dropped and stars multiplied overhead in ways they never did in cities. His brother told stories about their father that Michael had never heard. Small rebellions, quiet moments of defiance against the safe life he'd built. Hints that maybe the old man had understood what he was giving up, even as he continued making the same choices. He told me once, his brother said, that his biggest regret wasn't the risks he took. It was all the risks he didn't take, all the possibilities he talked himself out of before even trying. He'd tell you about redemption? No. That was your story with him. Mine was different. He told me about a business he'd wanted to start, some kind of workshop where he'd build furniture, had the whole thing planned out, never did it, too risky, too uncertain, stayed at the factory job he hated because it was stable. Michael thought about the $17,000, the inheritance that had made all of this possible. Maybe that's why he left me the money, not to be safe with, but to do something he couldn't. Maybe, his brother agreed, and maybe that's why I'm so angry with you, because you actually did it. You took the chance he couldn't take. You risked everything on something everyone said was impossible, and it worked. And that makes every safe choice I've ever made feel like cowardice. Safe isn't cowardice, isn't it? When you choose safe because you're afraid of failing, when you spend your whole life avoiding risk and end up with nothing but money and regret. They sat in silence after that, watching the night deepen around them, each considering the choices they'd made and the lives those choices had created. His brother left the next morning, hugging Michael at his rental car in a way they hadn't since they were children. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For showing me what's possible, for proving that failure isn't the worst thing that can happen, that the worst thing is never trying at all." Michael watched him drive away, disappearing down the dirt road toward the highway, toward a life that probably wouldn't change, but might finally consider changing. He felt something settle in his chest, not quite forgiveness, because there was nothing to forgive, but recognition that they'd both been trying to honor their father's memory, just in completely different ways. Fall became winter, became another spring. The operation expanded again, a third greenhouse, partnerships with a dozen high-end restaurants, contracts with specialty grocers across 3 states. Emma went off to college with a scholarship and a standing offer to return summers and breaks. Robert designed an aquaponics system that increased yields while reducing resource use. 2 more employees joined, then 3. By the 3rd anniversary of Michael's arrival in Redemption, the operation employed 7 people in a town that had been hemorrhaging population for decades. Property values started rising for the first time in 20 years. Sarah's real estate business, which had been barely surviving, began seeing inquiries from people interested in moving to a place that was apparently not dying after all. Jack's hardware store had to hire help for the first time since the 80s. Michael bought the property next to his, another foreclosure, another collapsing dream, and began converting it to production space. Then another. By year 5, he owned 23 acres, ran 6 greenhouses, employed 14 people, and generated enough revenue that accountants started using words like expansion and franchising and regional distribution networks. The numbers were absurd. The house he'd bought for $12,000 was now the headquarters of an operation valued at somewhere around $2 million. The inheritance he'd been told would be wasted had multiplied into something his father could never have imagined. But here's what mattered more than the numbers, the work itself, the daily rhythm of growing things, of watching seeds become food, of creating something tangible and real that people needed. The community that had formed around the operation, not just employees, but the network of suppliers and clients and neighboring operations that had sprung up as Redemption transformed from dying town to case study in rural renewal. The sense that he'd done what his father couldn't. Not better, not as judgment, but as completion, as honoring a dream by making it real. Are you still watching? Drop a comment if you've made it this far. Tell me your city, your story, why this resonated. And subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens next is why I told you this story in the first place. Year 6 brought something unexpected. A business magazine ran a feature story about rural renewal success stories, and Michael's operation was the centerpiece. From condemned property to million-dollar business, how one man's crazy decision revitalized a dying town. The article included photos of the greenhouses, interviews with employees, financial breakdowns that made everything public and real. His brother sent him a copy with a note, "Dad would be proud. I'm proud. Sorry it took me so long to say it." The article brought attention. Investors started calling, business development people from the state, documentary filmmakers, other people in dying towns asking how to replicate what Michael had built. The quiet life he'd created became suddenly uncomfortably public. A venture capital firm offered to buy him out. $8 million for the business and all associated properties, with Michael staying on as a consultant for 2 years. $8 million. More than enough to change everything he'd built. $8 million. Cash. No contingencies. The kind of offer that arrives in a conference room with lawyers and projections and handshakes from people in suits who fly in from New York or San Francisco, treating rural Montana like an exotic acquisition. Michael sat at the kitchen table where he'd once spread out grant applications, now cluttered with contracts and financial models printed on glossy paper. The offer sat open in front of him, pages crisp and smelling faintly of expensive ink. Outside, the greenhouses hummed with the quiet efficiency of automated systems, trays of microgreens glowing under LED lights that mimicked a sun that never set. 14 employees depended on this place now. Paychecks, health insurance, futures tied to the improbable empire that had grown from a condemned house and a forgotten inheritance. He'd turned down smaller offers before, local buyers, regional chains. But $8 million was different. It was life-changing money, private jet money, philanthropy money, the kind of sum that let you rewrite your story from security guard who got lucky to self-made visionary. His brother had called immediately after reading the article, voice thick with something like awe. "Take it, Michael. That's more than most people dream of. You can start over anywhere, invest it wisely, live the life Dad wished he'd had." The life Dad wished he'd had. The words echoed as Michael walked the property that evening, gravel crunching under boots worn thin from 5 years of daily use. The air carried the sharp tang of pine sap and damp earth, mingled with the faint green scent of growing things pushing through soil. Stars wheeled overhead, sharper than any city sky, indifferent to human calculations of wealth. Jack found him there, sitting on the porch steps with a thermos of coffee gone cold. The old man lowered himself beside him with a groan of joints protesting movement. Heard about the offer. Word gets around. You gonna take it? Michael stared at the dark silhouettes of the greenhouses. I don't know. Jack nodded as if this was the expected answer. My wife and I had an offer once, back when the mine was still running strong. Some conglomerate wanted to buy the store, turn it into a distribution hub. 6 figures, more money than we'd see in 20 lifetimes combined. He paused, breath visible in the chill. We turned it down. Why? Because it wasn't just a store. It was mornings opening the doors, talking to ranchers about fence posts, watching kids buy their first fishing lures. It was the place where people came when they needed advice or a shoulder or just coffee that didn't taste like regret. Money can't buy that back. Michael thought about the employees. Emma back from college breaks, now managing the packing crew with the quiet competence of someone who'd found her place. Robert tinkering endlessly with water recirculation systems that saved thousands in utilities. The new hires, young families who'd moved to Redemption because jobs existed here now, because a town no longer felt like a grave. Sarah's real estate listings filled faster than she could post them. Jack's store expanded into a second building. The diner added menu items featuring local microgreens from Chen Farms. Turning it down meant betting on himself again, on the fragility of markets and weather and the human capacity for betrayal. Accepting meant certainty, but also severance from the soil, the rhythm, the proof that one person's crazy choice could ripple outward and lift a community. The decision weighed heavier with each passing day. His brother arrived unannounced a week later, rental car caked in mud, carrying a bottle of scotch and spreadsheets showing projected returns on the 8 million. Invested conservatively, you could generate $500,000 a year passively. They sat at that same kitchen table, papers everywhere, the contract glowing under lamplight like a siren. You're hesitating because you're afraid of change, his brother said, pouring measures into mismatched glasses. You built this from nothing. Proved everyone wrong. Now cash it in. Build something else, a foundation, philanthropy, travel, whatever you want. Michael sipped the scotch, smooth and peaty, worlds away from the diner coffee of their shared past. What if this is what I want? His brother leaned forward, intensity sharpening his features. This is work. Endless, grinding work. You're 40 now. When do you live? Dad worked until he dropped, chasing security that never felt secure. Don't repeat that. The words landed like stones in still water. Michael set down his glass, walked to the window overlooking the greenhouses. Inside, night shift workers moved like shadows, harvesting under soft lights, their breath fogging glass panes. Dad didn't chase security, he settled for it, afraid of failing big. You're doing the same, chasing numbers on statements, promotions that mean more hours, more stress, safe choices that leave you empty. His brother flushed. And you're romanticizing hardship. This place could collapse tomorrow. Drought, disease, a competitor undercutting your prices. 8 million is real. Real like what Dad left me? $17,000 and a story about a town he wished he'd claimed? Michael turned. That money wasn't for safety. It was a shove toward possibility. I turned it into this. What if selling now is just trading one regret for another? They argued through the night, voices rising, then falling, circling the core truth neither wanted to face fully. Money buys options, but options don't guarantee meaning. His brother left at dawn, frustrated handshake at the door, a final plea hanging in the air. Think about the numbers, Michael, not the feelings. The town felt the tension without words. Sarah brought pie one afternoon, her silver hair catching sunlight as she slid the dish across the table. People are talking, worried you'll sell and leave us back where we started. I'm not selling. She studied him. Pie knife paused. You sure? Not yet. Margaret stopped by during harvest, wiping soil from hands cracked by years in the fields. My wife and I almost sold our farm once, debts piling up, kids needing college. Offer was good, but we realized the land wasn't just dirt. It was our mornings together, the smell of turned earth, the way it rooted us when everything else shifted. She squeezed his shoulder. Wealth isn't what you hold. It's what holds you. Jack's words came back too, layered with decades. Robert shared stories of aerospace layoffs, golden parachutes that bought condos, but not purpose. Emma confessed dreams deferred for practical jobs before finding this. Each voice, a thread weaving into the decision, turning abstract risk into human stakes. The venture capitalists scheduled a final meeting, flying in on a chartered plane that looked comical landing on the cracked airstrip 20 miles out. They gathered in the largest greenhouse, surrounded by trays of vibrant greens, pea shoots curling like question marks, radish sprouts sharp with promise. Suits amid soil, clipboards noting infrastructure while ignoring the hands that tended it. 8 million stands, their lead said, extending a pen. Sign, and you're free. Michael looked around at the employees pausing work to watch, faces etched with quiet hope. At the glass walls fogged by humid growth, at the land stretching beyond, no longer wild but cultivated, alive, free. The word tasted like ash. He set the pen down. No. The lead blinked. 9 million? Not about the number. Michael gestured to the space. This isn't a business, it's a life. Lives. My father's unlived dream, made real. Selling would honor the money, not the man who left it, or the choice I made with it. Silence stretched, broken only by the soft hiss of irrigation lines. The suits packed papers with professional disappointment, helicopter blades whirring later like retreating defeat. Word spread before they cleared the property line. That night, the town gathered uninvited. Jack with coolers of beer, Sarah with her famous cobbler, Margaret and Amy with farm tables dragged from their barn, Emma firing up a grill with cuts from a local rancher. Employees brought sides, stories, laughter echoing off greenhouse glass. Stars blanketed the sky as they ate on makeshift benches, fire pits crackling against the chill, the air rich with smoke and shared plates. His brother called as the party wound down, voice softer over the line. Heard you turned it down? Yeah. Regret it? Michael looked across the faces, creased with years or young with possibility, all bound by this improbable place. No. This is the wealth Dad meant. Not dollars, time, roots, impact that outlives you. Playing safe builds accounts, crazy builds legacies. His brother exhaled. Maybe you're right. Coming back next month, with ideas for my own crazy. The call ended. Michael pocketed the phone, joined the circle around the largest fire, flames dancing on familiar faces. Jack raised a bottle. To the crazy ones. Laughter rippled, glasses clinked. And in that moment, with the scent of wood smoke curling upward and mountains standing sentinel, Michael understood the true inheritance, not the $17,000, but the permission to choose possibility over certainty. Poverty isn't empty pockets, it's unlived dreams. Wealth isn't millions banked. It's mornings that matter, soil under nails, a community breathing because you dared. Redemption didn't die, it bloomed. And Michael Chen, once thought crazy, became the quiet millionaire who chose dirt over dollars, the richest man in town, measured not by what he took, but by what he grew. Hey, if this story moved you, drop your city in the comments one last time. Like, subscribe, share with someone trading safety for empty security. Because real wealth starts when you say yes to the crazy inside. Fade to stars.